Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Katie Burke.
Today on the show, we have John Sullivan. John is a sporting art and waterfowl collector and historian. Am I right in that did you grow up in Fallston, Maryland, or do you just live there now, John?
I grew up in Fallston, Maryland, in the center of beautiful Harford County, and spent my entire lifetime. I've moved approximately 2 miles from the home where I was born.
Well, welcome to the show. I'm glad to have you here today.
Glad to be here.
All right, so let's talk about, so you grew up in Fallston, Maryland, and you're from that, the area of the Chesapeake Bay, and it's so rich in waterfowling history and tradition. So how did growing up in that area of the country inspire you to become the collector and historian you are today?
My parents had a pair of historic decoys that sat in their living room from the time I was born, probably. And I started moving them from the fireplace hearth up to my bedroom at quite a young age. And at probably age 10 or 12, my maternal grandmother gave me my very own decoy. And it became the focal point of my bedroom. When my father was painting the shutters on the house, that wonderful shutter green that all the shutters in this part of the country were painted, I painted the decoy shutter green so it would match my cowboy theme wallpaper, which was green. And when I was about 16 years old, I realized it wasn't such a good idea to have that dark green paint on that old decoy. And I took the paint off of it, and it retained its position in my bedroom as the focal point. And years later, in carrying the decoy around after I started accumulating others, I was determined who made it. It was made over in the Cecil County area of Maryland by a carver named Benjamin Dye, one of the earliest carvers from this region. And it had the letter H carved in the bottom of that decoy, which was from the rig of Jess Heisler from Charlestown in Cecil County, Maryland. And later, I accumulated others decoys by Ben Dye with the Heisler brand on the bottom. And then lo and behold, maybe another 20 years passed by, and I acquired his sink box. The sink box had been stored in the Heisler garage up in a loft for many years, and now it resides in my home and is filled with decoys from that particular rig and other rigs that were used on the Susquehanna Flats. Perhaps some listeners, I'm sure most of your podcast listeners recognize what a rig of decoys was, but on the Susquehanna Flats, the upper Chesapeake Bay, some of these rigs that you use around the sink box might have 200 or 300 decoys in them. So the decoy, historic decoys in this area, there was thousands of them literally to pick from. And I started doing that at a young age, very young age. Fortunate in my collecting career that one of the preeminent carvers from the region, Madison Mitchell's son, worked alongside me in the county office building in the county seat. And I was buying Mitchell decoys in those days in the 60s for the duck decoys were $6 a piece. Full-size Canada geese were $8 a piece, and the full-size swan were $100 a piece. And I had to hide the swan when I brought him home. But we would meet every Monday morning on the parking lot, and he'd bring his county vehicle next to mine, and I'd have a little bit of cash, and he'd have a trunk load of decoys for me. That's how the accumulation started. I probably have 1,000 here in the house. And at some point, young Mr. Mitchell realized that I would pay a couple dollars more for old decoys than I would for his father's new decoys. So when rigs of decoys would go into Mr. Mitchell's shop to be repainted, Mr. Mitchell would switch them out, and I would get the old ones, and the hunter, who didn't really care, would get brand new Madison Mitchell decoys. I think I got the better end of the deal because I've kept all the old ones.
I think you did, yeah. So do you have this quote I read the other day that you wrote to Canvasback, and I just loved it, so I want to read it real quick. So hopefully I don't embarrass you. It says, "Some of us love history and long for days gone by. History is the core of our very fiber. It is all of the ingredients of our past that makes us who we are today. And I love that. And as a historian, it kind of really spoke to me. What do you think it is, before we get back to you, what it is about certain people that are drawn to the past in this way and kind of make it a part of us? What is your thought on that?
It recently came to me exactly what that is, Katie, and that my connection to the past. I'm considered now a time traveler because I long for those days. You know, there's certain aromas from those days that linger in my head when I would go into a decoy shop in Havertide when an old time decoy maker would be turning his white pine bodies and carving his cedar heads. That the smell of that lingers with me and draws me back to days long since gone by that, a lot of the modern waterfowlers that are using the plastic decoys or styrofoam decoys or shells or whatever the modern material is, they don't have that connection. I mean, it's an earthiness, it's an aroma that just sticks with me, and I can instantly recall it. But it puts me back into those days. My family were not great waterfowlers, but they were sportsmen and they were hunters. You know, my aunt was the first person to put a shotgun up to my shoulder and teach me how to shoot a shotgun. And looking back in these logs and journals that I have, when I find these later shooters being invited to these gunning clubs up here by their husbands or fiancés were invited to go out shooting. You know, I have that connection from my family. We had the smokehouse on our farm property in Falston was also the place where my grandfather loaded his shotgun shells. And, you know, that smell, you know, anytime I'm around gunpowder, I'm back into that shed as a youngster. And I've been extremely fortunate in my life. And I've taken a lot of abuse and joking about this because I grew up in this historic home in Falston, and I immediately find myself as a youngster exploring what was up in the attic. And it was in the attic of that house that I found my grandfather's shotgun. I have it to this day, and it wasn't an expensive shotgun. It was called the Interchangeable, and it had two sets of barrels which could be switched. And in my father's youth, he had carved his initials onto the stock of the shotgun, and we share the same name, so I didn't have to, as a youngster, I didn't have to carve my own initials in there because they duplicated others. But the times have changed so much, and I remember getting on the school bus with that shotgun and taking it in for show and tell. And on May Day, I posed as Daniel Boone and paraded around the maypole carrying my grandfather's shotgun. Today, the whole school would be shut down. Times have changed, Katie.
They have. We used to do the same. I would go turkey hunting in the morning and have my shotgun in the back of my car while I went to class. And that was fine in Mississippi. But not anymore. Yeah, it is. It's true. Like this, you talk about the smells. There are certain smells that take me back to the duck blind as a kid with my dad and things like that. You know, one thing that I'm jealous of you as that where you lived and became a collector and you started so young is you got to really be with a lot of these carvers that aren't around today. And what kind of influence and impact has that made on you and change your trajectory?
Well, you know, they try to carry on the same tradition, and some of the smells are the same, but you know, it took me to a different place than so many of modern day collectors have ever been. There's a lot of collectors out there today that consider when they buy what they term to be the best, it's an investment to them. And I've never considered anything that's in my house or in my, I don't call it a man cave because the whole house is essentially a man cave, but I don't consider it an investment. It's just the stuff I love. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't handle these things and look at them. The other thing, Katie, that I've been extremely fortunate in addition to knowing these old time carvers and old time gunners as well, was having access to primary source information. And many of the writers today rely solely on the internet. And because a lot of the old timers that they would, at one time, a writer would have interviewed these people, they're gone now. So they rely on the internet and they pull up ancestry records from ancestry.com or one of those websites, or the census records. And in their writing, they might go back to the seventh or eighth great grandfather of a particular carver, which really means very little to most readers. They're more anxious, to know what that carver did. But I was able to interview the carvers and interview these old time waterfowlers, and then travel to the areas where they had gunned. Unfortunately, in this part of the county that I'm in, the United States Army took so much of this property in 1918 when they built the Aberdeen Proving Ground and the Edgewood Arsenal. And the gunning clubs left the area. Most of them moved south. If they maintained the club, they went to North Carolina or the Currituck Sound. But I've been to those areas, with the approval of the United States Army, and seen the sites of where these wonderful clubs once were. And the amount of waterfowl that you would see even in these days is just amazing. And I can't imagine what it would have been, before the turn of into the 1900s. The earliest gunning club up in this region that I've dated was from 1819 at Maxwell's Point, and that became the county home of the Cadwalader family. And they, at the end of the time before the Army got it, they had over 7,000 acres of waterfront property on what was called the Gunpowder Neck of Harford County, where the Edgewood Arsenal was constructed. And they crossed over into Baltimore County, and they also owned where Carroll's Island Ducking Club was, one of the most famous clubs in the upper Chesapeake Bay.
Yeah, so what was it? Because as you mentioned before this, the Chesapeake Bay, this area, especially this part of this land that you're talking about, hosted some of the most affluent gunning clubs in the country. What was it about the habitat there, the ducks there, and the location of it that drew these people to that part of the country?
Well, if you could name one specific fowl, would have been the canvasback duck. And the canvasback duck, it was world famous, literally, because there's records of shipping canvasbacks to Great Britain, packing them in ice and shipping them overseas. But the wild celery that grew on the Susquehanna Flats brought the canvasbacks and the redheads, ballpates, and scaup to the area. But the canvasback would have been the most famous, and they were an Epicurean's delight, and they were sold in all the markets. The advent of the rail system up and down the East Coast, their popularity really increased when you could barrel them up and ship them to New York or Philadelphia, and that brought the hunters here. And the wealthy sports were in direct competition with the market hunters who were selling the fowl to the markets. Most recently, my most recent writing on a gunning club was the Eldon Ducking Club, which was on the Spasucia Narrows, right across from Spasucia Island outside of Havre de Grace. And the members all came from New York or New Jersey. And some of them held duplicate memberships in the Spasucia Island Rod and Gun Club and the Eldon Ducking Club. So many of these early clubs established very strict conservation protocol for how many fowl could be taken, and the use of blinds, and restricting the number of guests that a specific member could bring to the blind, and drawing for blinds, but most particular, limiting the number of fowl before conservation laws were put into place.
So this is something I'm curious about, because the hunting practices in this area are so indicative to this area, especially and having a museum with some of these artifacts and stuff in it. People ask, and I just am not as knowledgeable as I would like to be. But what was it about this area where they had the pass shooting, the bar shooting, duck tolling, sink boxes? Why did everything kind of, and did it, I'm pretty sure it birthed out of this area, but what was it about this area that kind of brought all that about?
I would, attribute it to, primarily to the canvasback ducks and it being the king of fowl, as deemed by these early hunters. But you talked about the different methods employed, and what changed it forever was the advent of the automatic shotgun. When you think of a gentleman shooting out of a sink box and he's shooting a muzzle loading gun and the efforts that would take to get his powder and shot down that barrel. And then we come along with a breech loader where if he'd have two shotguns with him, he's going to have four shots before he has to reload. But then when John Browning patented the automatic shotgun, it changed everything. And that led to the legislation which outlawed the sink box in 1935. Maryland was one of the forerunners for conservation of fowl, and as early as 1832, the first legislation was passed which outlawed the use of big guns. And they never particularly described a big gun other than the fact that a gun that could not be conveniently fired from the shoulder was how they described a big gun. And what they were referring to was punt guns or swivel guns that would be used in a sink box.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And then the big guns, I still have a hard time fathoming them shooting these big four bore guns. But when you read your books and your writings, that they couldn't, like, it wasn't just anyone who used those guns. You had to be a good shot to use those guns. Can you explain that a little bit more? Because it's not super clear.
You had to be a good shot and a pretty sizable individual. Ferdinand Latrobe, who was one of the principal members of the Carroll's Island Ducking Club, was famous for the use of his 4-bore shotgun. And, he was probably a 230-pound man. And, he's making a lot of those direct overhead shots when they were shooting on the points from the bar. And, otherwise it would be knocking him down a little bit with each shot.
Yeah. I just can't imagine. I cleaned them. We have them in the museum and, they're 20 pounds. They're not little guns. And you would have to be 230 pounds to shoot that thing. But yeah, it's crazy. And I'm guessing you wouldn't do it. Would they not do it often? It would just be, they'd do it every, so I wouldn't do it every day, I'm assuming.
I think it had a lot to do with how high the fowl were flying a particular day and what blind location, they drew at the morning drawing for the blinds.
All right. Okay. That makes more sense. Yeah, that's clear. So you've spent a lot of your spare time, not just collecting and researching, all this, but you also spent a lot of your time as an advocate and educating people. Why do you think teaching people about this history and this, I guess, tradition is so important?
I think it's important to teach novices, about early conservation methods, that it's just not something that the state or the government came up in recent years, but they have to understand that, we were protecting our natural resources pretty early on in this country. Although, people hear tales of the outlaw gunners and how many birds they'd shoot. That was certainly the exception. It wasn't the rule, particular in this area. We were the first area in the country to establish what was known as the ducking police. That was in 1872, and the area that they patrolled was the Susquehanna Flats, and they established specific times when the sink box could be put in location. It couldn't be before 5 a.m. And, they'd mark the location, but they got fined pretty severely, and their gunning supplies confiscated by the ducking police. But to properly educate young people that are novices to this, and it is very important to stress the conservation methods that were in place and get the facts straight for them, because many times, for some reason, the tradition that someone came up with the idea that they would load these big guns with glass and bent nails or whatever they had, is totally untrue. That they were they used them to kill fowl, and they're going to treat it like they would any fine piece of equipment. They're going to take care of it. They're going to clean it every day. They're just not, many times after they were outlawed, the rumor has it that they would lower them into the water and to hide them from the ducking police. That was certainly the exception. And, they treated it with a great deal of respect because it's how they were making their livelihood.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned how it has been this like market hunting era has been romanticized in a way. And it wasn't, but at the same time, and we've talked about this before, but at the same time, you still had people conservation minded, especially in the more affluent clubs and things. Like they thought about the resource and the habitat. It wasn't just about, market hunters and club members were very different in where they came from and why they were doing it, and had different motives behind it. How, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but how would the clubs view the market hunters in that time? Was it a friendly relationship, or what was that like between them?
I don't think it was particularly friendly. The records of the Carroll's Island Ducking Club, where they had gone out on their own and confiscated from market gunners the big gun. And they actually, I have a photograph where they would disassemble, break the punt gun up, so it could never be used again. So I don't think the relationships were particularly good. If they're confiscating their, what they're making a livelihood on. But, most of the clubs record, that they heard a big gunfire, and the next day that would be the end of it, because they'd actually go at, run them off. There was a family, a Boyer family from Harford County that spent a couple years trying to find the market gunner that was gunning outside their shores on the Bush River neck. And they ultimately found him, and his big gun was confiscated and taken to the Department of Interior, where it was stored for decades in Washington, D.C. It's a rather famous case, but they were able to, word of mouth, they knew the location of most of these outlaw hunters, and were able to have them put out of business.
That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah, I was talking to Dan Teal actually on the podcast not long ago, and we were talking about Nash Buckingham and the American Wildfowlers. And one of the things in there that I think applies to this that I found really interesting, at the time when they were, thinking about what they were going to do and how they were going to put in these laws, one of the things they weren't going to do was really regulate the clubs, because they found that the clubs were maintaining the habitat and they weren't as much of an issue on shooting, so that in some of their first proposals, they weren't going to, police the clubs like they were other things. I just found that really interesting, because as you talk about this, the clubs had their own rules. They kind of enforced their own hunters. What do you think about that? Do you know that about the American Wildfowlers?
No, I'm not familiar with that particular organization, but I know for a fact, because it's written in my primary source information about what they would do to control their own natural areas that they were maintaining, and building their blinds and maintaining shorelines, before the rest of the world was thinking about maintaining the shoreline and controlling erosion, even in early days.
Yeah, that's so ahead of its time. It's really great. I don't want to go without talking about this, but I'd love to hear you speak about your mentor, Captain Henry, and what that relationship meant to you, and how that affected your life. Could you speak about him a little bit?
Henry and his family moved to Harford County, and they lived, I guess, 2 miles from my childhood home. And although Henry was somewhat older, we had a great affection for the Maryland-Pennsylvania Railroad, which was this delightful little steam line that ran right through where we grew up. And my grandfather had been the bridge and building foreman for that railroad from 1878 up until 1938. And the access, I always thought, was better than anyone else could have had, because of my grandfather's association, decade before I was born. But Henry and I grew up, loving that. And by the time I had my first BB gun, he had progressed to his first 22. And when he got out of the service in the 60s, we became friends once again, but this time about decoys. And we would have what we call decoy roundtable, and we had them for decades, where we'd sit down with a few decoys and maybe bring a couple other newer collectors in, and we'd talk about the style of a particular decoy maker. And when I mentioned earlier my primary source information, one of the best days I recall with Henry, he had a home in East Newmarket, Maryland, down in Dorchester County. I was at one of his shed, which was just piled with decoys, and he reached down from a shelf, and he had these unusual decoys with the fact that there was a cast iron ballast weight recessed into the underside of the decoy with initials on them. Some of the initials read ELB and some read TJH, which would not be the indication of the carver, but the indication of whose rig it was. And I said, Henry, what do you think this stands for? And neither one of us really know. And he said, oh, maybe that was Ed Parson, or maybe this was Tom Hansen or something like that. And about a year later, I was working in Harford County for the government, and they were cleaning out the attic of the Harford County Courthouse, getting ready to do a major renovation. And the clerk of the court called me up and he says, we have some old records up here that are getting ready to go to the landfill, if you'd be interested in seeing them. And they were the assessment records from this county from 1896 and 1902. They were packed into wooden biscuit boxes. I drove my pickup truck over and I carried 16 wooden boxes filled with these records, and I hauled them home with me to save them from the landfill. And the first box that I picked up was from the Gunpowder Neck and the Bush River Neck of the county, indicating the district and the property owner's name. And I picked up this little, what was called an assessor's day book, where the assessor had gone out in the field, made notation. And inside on the back paper of this little journal, this handwritten journal, was the Bartlett and Hayward rig, 500 decoys, and the men's name, Edward L. Bartlett and Thomas J. Hayward. And that was like one of the cementing factors in my decoy relationship with Henry, that I went back and I said, remember those decoys with the little iron pad? Let me show you something. And I pulled out this little book. I said, here's the maker, not the maker, but here's the owner of that rig, these two gentlemen. Because it was just merely speculation. Someone would make a name up or speculate as to who it possibly could have been. And there in my hand, I had the fact. Here it is. And I think our relationship from that day forward, with me having that access to, who owned these many, many thousands of decoys that were used in that part of the county, really helped our relationship. And it just got better through the years.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you're lucky to have that job and that hobby, and it just kind of all things aligned.
We spent, we traveled to Maine together for 20 years to the decoy auctions. And while the auctions were going on, if there was nothing we were particularly interested in, we would be driving through the country roads of Maine, stopping in anyone's property that looked like they had anything old or interesting. We had some great times. It was a wonderful relationship.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing. So you've had a lot of, we've done a lot of work with museums, particularly in that area, the Havre de Grace Museum, Decoy Museum you mentioned, as well as the Ward. And this is kind of a selfish question, but since you've played that role as a someone that helps them and identifying different things, and then, just your roles in museums, what do you think? Now that we're going forward, we have more museums paying attention to decoys, not just these waterfowling museums, but some of the larger art museums as well. What do you think the role of museums in this is forward?
Certainly to teach the history appropriately, to tell them the importance of of what the duck decoy meant in this country. That it's really been recognized as truly a unique contribution to Americana. It was when you look at all the folk art that was created. It's certainly at the very front of the list of true Americana. That was a unique piece of art, simply made us a tool for the hunter, but progressed past the tool stage into an artifact and a piece of art. And museums exhibiting them, and in the Maryland Historical Society, now known as the Maryland Center for History and Culture, has had an exhibit there of waterfowl artifacts since the day it opened, and one of the earliest historical societies in the country. And put it first and foremost when you go in there. I mean, that's where I was always attracted to, and now I'm a trustee of that organization, and I hope that we can do another exhibit. We did an exhibit there in '91 of Maryland's 100 best decoys, and I hope we can do another one. But people come to the Havre de Grace Decoy Museum from all up and down the country. It's we keep a roll there of where these people are from, and it's interesting. I've had people walk in the door and say, "Is this a real museum, or is this just a decoy of a museum?" And I said, "No, this is the decoy museum."
Decoy of a museum. I never thought about that. Yeah, that's interesting. So before we go, is there anything that you would like to add, or anything that you'd like to say before we sign off?
My experience with Ducks Unlimited has been truly a unique experience in my lifetime, and very important to me. And I remember seeing those as a young man, those first decals rather on the rear windows of a pickup truck or a car down the road, and think, how do I get one of those someday? And a lot of these older gentlemen, waterfowlers, I'd see their magazines, and then I eventually, took one of their magazines and applied for membership. And I started doing exhibits at the local chapters of Ducks Unlimited up here back in the early 1970s. And then, much to my surprise and joys, when I got the proclamation from President Hoyt in 2018 at an event at the Decoy Museum, total shock to my system, where I was raising my contributions. But really an honor for me, thinking how long that journey's been with Ducks Unlimited.
Yeah, and you have things at the museum as well, and they're pretty popular, so don't ask for them back, please.
Oh, okay.
Well, John, I could talk to you all day. I have a million questions, but we should probably wrap up. Well, thank you for coming on the show.
Truly a delight to talk to you, and I hope this works out.
Thanks again to our guest, John Sullivan. Thanks to our producer, Chris Isaac, and thanks to you for supporting wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.